Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and you are viewing this on election night, November 8th at 7 p.m. We're actually taping it ahead of time, the Friday before election, because during election day, too many of us will be running around crazy doing other things. So if you have not yet voted, you live in New London, wherever you live, actually vote. But if you live in New London, District 1 votes at New London High School, District 2 at Harbor School, District 3 at Nathan Hale. And if you happen to not be registered but feel inspired to vote, you can go to the registrar's office at City Hall, second floor, for election day registration. You can register and vote on the spot. And this show will be up on the internet, so vote first, and you can watch the show later if it comes to that. And so after you vote, it's been really a rough election, I think, in terms of the tone. And so I think on Wednesday, we'll all have to kind of sit back, relax, breathe a sigh of relief. And then the day after that, we all still have work to do. So having said that, I'm going to introduce today's guest, Jeffery Hart. And I don't know when I first talked to Jeffery about it, certainly at least a few years ago, about not so much political candidates, but about how our elections work and your interest in how our government does represent us. So welcome, Jeffery.
Thanks for having me.
And I guess we can start that you can talk about what got you interested in how our voting system relates to how represented we feel by our government.
Well, actually, I took a class at Eastern many moons ago, and it was a European Union class. And I got to find out how many political parties are in Germany and how many are in Italy and France. And I heard these crazy terms like the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats and all these, great multi-party goings on. I said, why can't we have that here? And it comes to find out that they have different ways of holding elections over there. They have constitutions that were all basically written and rewritten after World War II that have taken some of the ideas that we in our republic had used and built on them, and they count the votes in a little bit different way. And slowly but surely, I've come to find out that the way you count the votes matters a lot more than who the candidates are or what policy you happen to like. And so, especially with this awful election season being over, so close to being over, I'm really happy to step away from candidates and talk about elections themselves for a while.
Now, we all agree that voting is really important, and I think there's been an unprecedented number of young people, 18 to 25-year-olds registering and getting interested in this election. But there are a lot of obstacles to voter confidence, let's say, in our system. And we both looked at a film we ended up not being able to share with you here, but it talked about the California primary and all of the things that happened there that really did not inspire voter confidence. So do you want to talk a little bit about some of the problems that we're seeing in California this past spring?
Oh yeah, and California is a great microcosm of the country because basically anything that could go wrong went wrong in California. The documentary, if anyone is interested in looking at, is called Uncounted, the Story of the California Primary, and it's produced by the same people that produced The Young Turks, if you're familiar with them or their podcast. And one of the things that you had in bulk was people showing up to vote and finding that they weren't on their registration. Now, we've had some problems with our registration databases here, some mistakes. Right. I think every state probably does. We're probably not anywhere near the worst case scenario. In Connecticut, we have it pretty good, but still, even just before this segment, the manager of this fine establishment, Mary Jane, was telling me her little horror story about trying to rectify that. If you do get dropped off the list of voters, it is not easy. It can take you all day to fix it. That's assuming you got there early, assuming you know what to do and have the wherewithal to continue the fight. Even though you may not be in the right district, you may not have to go to some distant city hall where you used to live. So that's one major thing. If you are given a ballot, what do you call that, a provisional ballot, it might not be counted. A lot of people don't know that you then have to take steps to make sure the provisional ballot is counted. It's not automatically counted. So if there is a mistake in your registration, you're better off sorting it out that day.
Rather than going for a provisional ballot.
Yes.
I know that some of the problems in California were things that were not pertinent to Connecticut. We don't have mail-in, ballots except for absentee ballots.
Yeah.
There was a lot of confusion around that. But in terms of people getting dropped sort of arbitrarily or disenfranchised in other ways, one of our Green Party members who lives in a different part of state, who has been an active voter, I'm sure, for 35 years, moved from town to town. When he changed the address on his driver's license, he was dropped, his voter registration was dropped, and we discovered it when going over an internal party mailing and saw, like, why is this guy not registered? He's like active in the state party, and per DMV, he's just off the voter rolls.
Right.
And he was not able to rectify it through the online registration system, but he had to go in and see the new registrar. And once again, if you have to have proof of your new residency. When my elderly mom moved from Maryland to Connecticut when she was 86 years old, we registered her to vote. I don't know if her absentee ballots were ever counted because we could never. The voter ID laws is you don't have to, in Connecticut, show a driver's license, although they ask, but you're not required to show it every time you vote. But when you register, they want to see that ID an initial time. And my mother's passport she was 86, her passport had expired like 8 or 9 years before. She didn't have a driver's license. She had a Maryland ID, but it had also expired because she had broken her arm and she was in like the convalescent home when it was due to get renewed, and she had missed that window. And honestly, I don't really know. She always cast ballots for 5 years. I don't know if her votes were actually counted or not.
Yeah, it's not that easy. A lot of people make it seem like it's just you go, you show your ID, you vote, and you go home. It is not always that easy, and everybody has the right to vote, even if you're in a bad situation, even if you're in the hospital. No matter where you are, you have the right to vote. So this may be a very controversial position, and I know it does not represent the position of any body that I'm a part of, but it is my position that the burden of proof should be on the government, not on the individual voter. That when you do fill out a provisional ballot, it should be counted unless the government can prove that it's fraudulent, unless the government can prove that it should be handled a different way. And if it is handled by due process, they should let you know what that process was, how you can influence it, and what the result is.
And I guess part of the reasoning behind having some of these rules is fear of voter fraud, but that isn't really much of a fear.
Well, the bigger fear is that every time you put a regulation or a requirement in between the voter and the ballot, that is an opportunity for voter fraud. And we may not always call it voter fraud, we may call it other things, but there is an opportunity for wholesale voter fraud, for districts to be taken by bad actors, versus an individual trying to vote in the wrong district. To wait, what strategic choice could you make by voting in the town next to you instead of the town you live at, or any one of the variations along that lines.
And next week, so people know, after the election, we always invite Luther Weeks from Connecticut Voters Count to be on the show. He does not agree with some of what we will talk about at this show, but he is very concerned that when people cast votes, the votes are counted and they're counted accurately, because otherwise you've lost voting integrity in our system and voter confidence. And he recently wrote testimony that said, I agree there is almost no in-person voter fraud nor anything else close to numbers of illegally registered individuals voting. So there are vulnerabilities in the system, but having individuals come up and voting fraudulently is not one of the problems.
Certainly, and I understand that voter ID laws, people are really concerned about individual voter fraud. People are concerned about voter fraud and all. I don't want to dismiss that. It's certainly not that it can't happen. It can, let's admit that it can, but there are other solutions besides requiring an ID. I mean, it sounds a little silly, but in Iraq they use a little purple dye on your thumb, and you certainly can't vote twice then, can you?
No, you can't. And that brings to light the bigger problem, the more generalized problem, that there are a lot of people in this country who are disenfranchised for a multitude of reasons.
And some people who have no faith in the integrity of the voting are not going to vote. Let's be clear about that too. Whenever we have these questions about does your vote count, you will have people say, well, then why should I bother?
And I think what was pointed out in that California video was that because of Bernie Sanders' campaign largely, a lot of people who had thought previously that voting didn't mean anything were inspired to take part in the system.
Yes.
And their experiences did not necessarily encourage them to continue to take part in the system.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So, part of the problem is if you put too many obstacles in front of people who are just learning the system, it's really going to be discouraging. Sure, everyone should know the rules of the system, but this is so important. Can we handhold newbies a little bit?
Right. There are some really widely popular common sense reforms like allowing people more opportunities to register to vote in more places. I'm personally in favor of making sure that you don't have to go too far for a polling place, that you never run out of ballots at a polling place. I mean, right now we rely on the professional abilities of our secretaries of state and our registrars of voters. And in Connecticut, I think you'd have to agree, being a candidate for a long time, we have generally a good track record here. Mistakes get made everywhere, but I think here in Connecticut we could develop some best practices that other states could take note of, and they could not just be someone's experience. They could be the law. They could be the way to do it.
And we're going to talk about some of those other things in a solutions piece, which,
sure.
But but that point you're bringing up does bring up that one of the laws of the land is that voting is managed on a state-by-state basis.
Yeah.
And within each state, it becomes an internal issue, but when you're talking about a presidential election, it impacts the whole country. There are very different laws about whether felons or can vote while they're serving their time, after they've served their time, when we know about disparities in incarceration rates based on race and ethnicity and a socioeconomic class.
Yeah.
When you disenfranchise felons, and sometimes for the rest of their lives, that's a lot of people who are not getting the right to vote, and they're of a group that's probably underrepresented.
And when one state does it and another one doesn't, it raises very serious issues nationally, doesn't it?
Yeah, and we live with those. The presidential election is really a difficult nut to crack, really, with if we want to keep voting rules determined on a state-by-state basis.
Yeah, and maybe there are some things that should stay on a state basis, but I think if you can eliminate the confusion of someone who shows up to vote and doesn't recognize the process from one state to another, not to just cherry pick on anybody, but caucuses are really, really very different than elections.
Yes.
We should have a very serious conversation about whether that's a legitimate way to keep voting, at least for federal elections, you know.
And one thing, looking at the California ballot, though, their primary is an open primary, unlike Connecticut. So people who are not party affiliated can choose the day of which ballot they want.
Yeah.
And the other difference is, in Connecticut, minor parties are not allowed to hold primaries. So while the Democrats and Republicans have primaries in Connecticut, the Greens have to have a caucus.
Have to.
Well, we're not allowed to have a primary.
Wow, I was not aware of that.
So minor parties, basically, we have a big nominating meeting and we send out notices to, you know, the best list we can come up with of registered Greens. I won't say the voting lists are always maintained really well. It's sort of on a town by town basis, and some registrars are more diligent than others. But yes, you will never see well, maybe not never, but at this time, you can't go in on primary day and say, I want my Green Party primary ballot.
Now, what's the effect of having a caucus in your voter turnout? How many people do you get to come to that caucus versus if you had a primary?
It is very embarrassing. The 7 electors for president, they are based on certainly less than 100 people voting. Probably some years it might be between 30 and 50 people voting on it at the caucus.
Statewide?
Statewide. Not that we have a ton of registered Greens. It's probably between 1,000 and 2,000, but we're more active than our numbers suggest.
But when you're talking about 1 or 2% of that number choosing the candidate.
Yeah, it's.
Wow.
So there are problems in Connecticut too, and part of the problem is that our registrar systems, you know, you have to have a Democratic registrar, you have to have a Republican registrar. In some towns, you can have a third registrar.
Yeah.
But in New London, we can't.
Right.
Because we don't have elected registrars. So going to another piece of an obstacle to having representative government, just our duopoly system.
Yes.
Is an issue. So maybe we'll talk about that really briefly, and then I have some PowerPoint pictures of different ballot designs.
Awesome.
So I want to share that. But let's talk a little bit about what's been the effect of this two-party system that functions often as a single incumbency.
Well, my biggest problem with that, I think, if you've been following the election, is the negativity, the attacks, and the nastiness that comes with the two-party system. If you can earn votes simply by discouraging the other party, making them stay home, making their candidate untenable, that leads to, you get a high return from negative voting. If you had a more open system with more candidates, with, you know, who had a seat at the table, so to speak, there would be less incentive to go negative. You would have to actually prove something about your candidate that was positive. And I am a registered Democrat. I'm part of the Democratic Town Committee here. So I'm certainly not suggesting that we break up the Democratic Party. But I don't think even the Democratic Party here, which is dominant, I don't think it is well served when there are negative campaigns. I don't think anybody is well served. Nobody wants to hear that. I'm sick of it as a voter.
Well, and I think it's a real challenge. I'm actually more worried about a few days after the election than who wins the election, because we are facing some major problems that will take a high level of community and cooperation to solve. I mean, climate change is not something that just a couple people can get together and solve. No. The militarization of our country, both in terms of foreign policy and policing, is a concern that can't just be dealt with by one person. So we need community, and yet so many of us, how many of us have lost Facebook friends or temporarily unfollowed people that maybe we'll be able to have more dialogue from because it just gets so exhausting?
Yeah, the takedowns, the nastiness, it's taken a toll, I think. I've had to explain to some people that Donald Trump and his supporters are not going to disappear the day after the election. They're going to be there. They're going to be a force. So you can have all the snarky comebacks you want, but the day after the election, you're still going to have to say something to those people who make up almost half of the country and move forward.
And oddly enough, though I am not encouraging anyone here to vote for Donald Trump, in New London, we've seen a lot of really odd coalitions around issues. And,
Yes,
5 years ago when we had the
Yes.
Riverside Park referendum, that coalition was across party lines. It was across the political spectrum. A lot of our city's most conservative, taxpayer group people were part of the alliance to not sell the park. And not all of us had exactly the same reasons for wanting to keep it. But when you have an election that in the end was decided by 19 votes out of almost 5,000 cast, you know what? You needed every single person in that alliance to be in on it. If we had, alienated those people ahead of time, it would have been lost.
Absolutely. And, around here in Connecticut, where Democrats really are dominant, we forget what it's like for Democrats in Texas, for example.
Right.
So making a rules change that might allow an opposition member to come onto our city council or to come onto our state legislature may seem like oh my goodness, what a traitor, he's shooting the party in the foot. But don't forget that the Republicans control the House because, district by district, they've got these districts on lockdown. So I think the Democrats in blue states, the Republicans in red states, and the green members everywhere would benefit from a more open system.
Agreed. So I want to look at a couple of slides here. And the first one is, this is the ballot that you and I will see.
Yeah.
Those people who live in New London who voted either New London High School or Harbor School will be seeing this ballot. And, interestingly, the green line is as full as the Republican line, which makes me very happy. But it's a state statute, and people in Connecticut probably aren't too aware of this, but if you look at ballots from around the country, there aren't a lot that are arranged like a grid like this. New York State's, some are. Here's what the people who live on the south end of New London, what their ballot will look like. Okay. The only difference is in the race for state representative, that it's Andre Baumgardner against Joe De La Cruz rather than Chris Soto and Andrew Lockwood and myself.
Yeah.
So, okay, but now this is my next ballot. This is what the Washington, D.C. ballot looks like. And you can't really see the names well. But for each office, the names are listed. It is a partisan election, so their parties are listed below the name. But there's no possibility of saying row A all the way or just go row C. You can vote for all Democrats and you can see who they are, but you're not going to be able to just be quite as mindless about it. You have to kind of look at the names of who you're choosing. So I would love to see our ballot replaced by something that looks a little more like this. The other thing I've found is a real problem, the way our current ballot is arranged, that referendum questions a lot of people often miss because they're either on the back or along the side or along the top. They're not in the main body. I've seen ballots like this where the questions are interspersed with the offices, so you can't really miss it. So I would love to see something that looks more like that.
I do see the benefit of that. Now, I know there's a lot of influence that the order candidates appear on the ballot can affect people's vote.
And I'm guessing that this order on the DC ballot is randomly selected. They are randomly, and this ballot was randomly selected.
Okay.
But within the line, it's like they'll put all the Democrats' names in a hat. And it is any of the public can observe this. They'll put all the Democrats running, let's say for city council, in a hat, and then they'll draw them in the order, and then they'll draw all the Republicans, and then they'll draw the Greens. But because of the weird grid, if a green is on two lines, they have to be directly beneath where they were on the Republican or Democratic line.
I have noticed
so it's
that.
really weird.
Because in this city, Greens have been cross-endorsed on the Republican ticket before.
Yeah. Try to break up the monopoly however we can.
That's right.
Okay, so the next one I want to show you, this is one type of IRV ballot. And we don't really have a film about IRV, ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting, but maybe you want to talk about it a little bit.
Well, I'm really excited about this right now because it happens to be a ballot question in Maine. And it's received a lot of press. One of my favorite organizations, fairvote.org, has been pushing this type of voting for a long time. You hear it called instant runoff voting, IRV. You hear it called ranked choice voting, which is how I like to talk about it.
My high school actually used the hair system for our class officers, and that is a form of IRV.
Awesome. Yeah, it
So
has
in
a lot
the
of
60s,
names.
like Girls High used IRV.
And you do see it used in local elections a lot, but I don't believe it's on any statewide basis yet. So Maine could be the first test case. Now, the first thing that changes about IRV is that we're looking for a majority, not a plurality.
Right.
And a lot of people hear that and say, wait a second, don't we have majority rule? Isn't this a democracy where we have majority rule? And actually, no. It's called plurality, which means that the person with the most votes wins, not the person with 50% of the votes wins.
And in the presidential election, I think it was really the 1992 election that Bill Clinton was elected, that he was not a majority president.
That's right.
Ross Perot got about 18 or 19% of the vote. So there was no majority. And it's anyone's guess who Ross Perot siphoned more votes off from. So people hear ad nauseum about the Nader effect, which I don't think really happened, but Perot might have.
It really might
We don't
have.
know.
He really drew from both sides, which is interesting. So it could have been down to a couple of votes, which is crazy. It's crazy. But traditionally in a majority system, you have to have a runoff when that happens.
Right.
If you demand 50% of the vote, then you
Right.
have a runoff between the top vote getters. So
Right.
it would have been a second election between just Clinton and Bush
Right.
if that happened. Thankfully, can you imagine how expensive and time consuming
And
that
not
could
just
have
that, the
been?
turnout is always much lower in a runoff election.
And you don't know who won for weeks. It can be a mess, and that's what the beauty of instant runoff voting is, that instead of having to have a large, expensive, time-consuming election, you indicate your second choice and your third choice. And so every one of Ross Perot's second choice votes would have been counted towards one side or the other, and we would have known that same night how America really felt about things, you know.
In Connecticut, I think around the same time, David Bingham ran for Congress, and it was a very close election between Sam Gadenson and Ed Munster. I think Sam won by maybe a dozen votes in the whole district. It was double digits. And David Bingham also was a very strong third candidate. He had been a Republican state rep who was also very active in both the environmental movements and in women's choice. So he said he caught hell, but he said, I have no idea who I took votes from.
Yeah.
So he became a huge proponent. Actually, I invited him on the show about a decade ago to talk about Sierra Club. And when he arrived, he said, I'll talk about Sierra Club tonight, but I really want to come back for a show on IRV.
Oh, good.
So this was quite a while ago. So I have a few different ballot formats so people can kind of just get an idea of what it looks like to rank your choices. So this particular one is a fill in the arrow. The first column you put your first choice, the second column you put your second choice, the third column you put your third choice. You're not required to give a second or third choice, but you have the option.
If you don't, then, and it comes to that, your vote won't count the
Right,
second
it's as
time
if
around.
a runoff election were held on a different day and you didn't show.
Yep.
It's kind of like that. So it might look like this, where you can fill in the bubbles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this one, some limit your choices to top 3. Some systems, there can be as many choices as candidates, or candidates plus 1 with a write-in. And one thing none of these have, which the Green Party ones do have, is none of the above.
None of the above.
Although with ranked choice, I guess the implication is that anyone you are not filling in a bubble for is kind of a none of the above. But a distinct none of the above has, in my opinion, has some virtue. Here's another one.
I think a lot of people would agree with you this year.
I think they would. You want to vote, but you don't want to vote for any names that are there. Although in the presidential race, I saw the list, and there are about 20 registered write-ins. And you really have to research them because a write-in in Connecticut cannot have a party affiliation next to their name. So I know Gloria LaRiva is one of the write-ins, and she's a socialist candidate. Mm-hmm. But there are about 20 choices. If you're thinking about writing in, you can go to the Secretary of State's website, and they have the list of candidates on the ballot, and they have the list of write-ins. Yeah. And there are not a whole lot of them for any office except for president. And president is a list.
And I will just note briefly that Bernie Sanders is not a write-in candidate, at least not on our ballot.
Right, and that's part of the Connecticut rule, is that to become a registered write-in, the candidate has to submit a form. Yeah. And actually, candidate consent is a big thing, by the way, in Connecticut. If someone is nominated, like for a Green Party, the candidate has to sign that form.
Okay.
So
I've heard some people suggest that we might need to take our politicians like jury members and haul them up and make them serve, but
yeah, maybe.
So far we've been able to find candidates who consent.
Who consent, yes. And here's just one other, format. So there isn't any single format for filling out, having a ballot with the ranked choice, being able to rank your choices, and none of them really look that complicated.
Yeah, it really is as simple as putting them in order, favorite to least favorite.
And then the last slide I have is just the website for Fair Vote, because they have been working on this issue and many others related to elections for a very long time. Yeah. And we'll later get another video from Fair Vote about one other problem and potential solution. Yeah. So we'll do that probably in about 5 or 10 minutes. 5. Okay, so one suggestion for improvement is initiating ranked choice voting and changing our ballots so that it really encourages people more to look at each candidate rather than just going straight party line. We talked about the main initiative. I wanted to point out that in 2010, when New London had a referendum question whether or not we should create the position of an elected mayor who was really an empowered executive in our city, the Charter Revision Commission at that time recommended that we demand a majority mayor, and it was not in their written recommendation, but their informal recommendation was to do it by way of ranked choice voting. And
Hear, hear.
Very interesting, it was a Charter Revision Commission that was mostly Republicans, interestingly, and but I don't know what happened when those recommendations went to City Council. The City Councilors threw them out.
Well, I'm sure you're more familiar with what the bar is to get one of those initiatives on the ballot.
For the Charter Revision Commission, it was really a funny process that the Charter Revision Commission made its recommendations, and then the city council voted on exactly what questions, how the questions would be worded on the ballot. So the majority mayor part was left out. There was also a proposal to have some kind of district representation rather than have all at-large council members. I'm not sure it's that's as much an issue now, but at the time, there were hardly any people on either the Board of Ed or on City Council who lived north of Bank Street.
Okay.
So that part of the city was not very represented. And that part also was not included. But it was very interesting to see some of our fairly prominent New London Republicans talking to the councilors and saying, a majority mayor is a good idea.
Yeah,
And that-
a majority is a good idea for any single seat. I'll state that unequivocally. We need a majority of the people to support somebody, or else you're not going to have a mandate to do anything.
Right, and New London, that first mayoral election, there were actually 6 candidates. So ironically, some people who were on city council who rejected that would have been helped.
Yeah.
Because they might have been people's first choice vote, but people wanted to go with someone they thought had a better chance of winning the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't think we need to mince words about that. The second choice candidates of the Republicans and of some of the other petitioning candidates could have changed the outcome of that election.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Taking the people's second choice votes into consideration could have changed it one way or another.
Right.
Whether you're happy with the way it came out or not, you should at least consider that it would be more fair.
Right. And I think the results of the 2011 mayoral election, the ultimate results might not have changed, but there would have been a lot of other voices that made themselves known.
Yeah.
So
it's really hard to say. And interestingly, if you find out that you were elected with some second choice votes, well, now you have a whole new constituency that you have to listen to that maybe you weren't campaigning to.
Right.
Maybe you find out that some of those voices in town aren't so opposed to you after all, and you want to work with them on something.
The Green Party has a weird constituency. We once did a study and found that, and this was a decade ago, that young Democrats under the age of 30 and Republicans over the age of 60 all liked the Greens. It was very odd. Anyway, we have a video, and I don't want to run out of time before we show it, and I want to be able to discuss it a little bit. So if we can cue that up. And this is from Fair Vote.
Our founding fathers created a new kind of nation, a nation based on the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founders knew that a free government had to be grounded in the consent of the governed. That's why they ensured that every member of our House of Representatives would be directly elected and regularly face the voters. The House, said John Adams, would be an exact portrait of the people. That vision is shattered today. Congress is dysfunctional, polarized, and paralyzed. Most districts are so partisanly lopsided that they're barely even contested. Nationally, in 2012, Democrats won the most votes, but Republicans won the most seats. Looking to 2014, Republicans need only 45% of the national vote to keep control of the House. These kinds of distortions break the link between voters and their government. When elections don't have consequences, where's the consent of the governed? The root cause isn't the usual suspects. It's not just campaign spending. It's not just gerrymandering. The Republican advantage is primarily due to long-standing patterns of where each party's supporters live. Today's hyper-partisan climate ensures that a district's partisan majority is far more likely to determine the outcome. Gerrymandering helped Republicans, but their national advantage wouldn't change much, even if district lines were drawn by a politically neutral saint. The root cause is our winner-take-all system. Rules that turned 51% of the votes into 100% of representation and 49% into zero. In other words, it's less redistricting than districting. Winner-take-all elections are always unfair to someone. Whole regions of the country now elect only one party. Men hold nearly 5 times as many seats as women. Racial minorities are underrepresented, and the middle has fallen out of Congress. Historically, these bridge builders came from districts where most voters usually favor the opposite party. In 1993, there were 47 such representatives. Today, only 6. That's barely 1% of the House. So, voters don't get the representation they voted for. Bridge builders can't win. Compromise goes out the window. Gridlock becomes the norm, and nothing gets done. Looks pretty bleak, but there is a solution. Hello, my name is Chris Novoselic, and I'm chairman of Fair Vote. You may know me from my work in music. However, I've always been interested in making our electoral process more inclusive and responsive. Fair Vote has an answer: fair representation voting grounded in our traditions and values. With fair representation, candidates compete to represent a particular district, just like now. But the districts are bigger and elect more than one person. The key is to use fair representation voting systems that ensure that winning the most votes gets you more seats, but not all seats. Instead, you will win 1 of 3 seats if 1 of 3 voters wants you to represent them. This math means fair representation of each region's left, center, and right all across America. To see how it works, here's our fair voting plan for Louisiana. Today, its 6 House seats are gerrymandered in a way that makes 5 of them safe for Republicans and 1 of them safe for Democrats. With fair voting, Louisiana would have 2 districts, 3 seats each. Voters would have 1 vote and would be allowed to rank the candidates in order to ensure the results are fair. Like-minded voters would earn a seat with more than a quarter of the total vote. They'd earn 2 seats if they cast more than half of the ballots. The result would be a fair reflection of Louisiana voters. The majority would get the biggest share, but almost everybody would be represented by someone they'd actually voted for. Here's our plan for Massachusetts and its 9 House seats. 40% of voters are Republicans, but no Republican has won in 2 decades. With 3 districts, each with 3 seats, Republicans would have the votes to win a seat in each district. We'd see shared representation of both parties across the state. Nationally, winning a majority of votes would mean winning a majority of seats, but being in the minority in your region wouldn't shut you out. At the same time, we'd elect more bridge builders, innovators who now rarely win. Social conservatives who like unions, social liberals who want small government, urban Republicans, rural Democrats, and so on. Third parties and independents could run without being spoilers. Most fundamentally, far more voters will have representatives who actually share their views. Reform is within our grasp. Fair representation voting is fully constitutional and already used locally. We're working with congressional reformers on a bill to require each state to create independent commissions tasked with drawing House districts designed for fair voting. That would eliminate partisan bias and forever kill the gerrymander. The full spectrum of voters would earn representation. That's real democracy. Visit fairvoting.us to see our fair representation voting plans and learn more about how they would transform our elections. To be part of our growing reform coalition, sign up at fairvoteaction.org. Let's work together to uphold our founders' vision and truly make Congress the people's house.
Yeah. Well, really, before I watched this morning, I had no clue about proportional representation, but it seems so pertinent.
Yeah.
And this is something you've been interested in for a long time, though, right?
This was the light bulb moment that went off. I found out that Germany elects more than half of its legislative body by proportional representation. I said, well, what is that? Oh my God, that's why they have so many parties. Relevant to the Green Party, the mathematical argument that a third party candidate spoils an election goes away
Yeah,
immediately.
totally.
And finding out that you can,
Yeah.
yeah, finding out you could do it that way really opened a door for me, and I've been interested in it for a long time. So when I found fairvote.org, I was really excited to see someone else had been working on this. I had been looking really hard for an organization like them, and so I send people there now for primers. They do a great video explanation. And they're the ones that push this ranked choice voting on the main ballot, too. They're very much behind that.
Oh, I'm sure. It's probably in about 2005, over 10 years ago, Caleb Klepner, who at that time worked for Fair Vote, was a guest on this show. And at the time, their focus was really ranked choice voting and going to all the towns, a lot of towns in California, to help train the public in using it, sometimes with people that weren't English language speakers, and collecting data on what problems there were and getting people to learn it. They didn't really find that it was difficult. And I'll tell you, ranking in some ways is easier than trying to figure out how to vote strategically if you just have to choose one.
Yeah, especially if you're not too familiar with the party rules and you think, well, if I vote this way, what will happen? If I vote that way, what will happen? You've got to get it right the first time, or else God forbid, you've done the wrong vote.
And the issue with proportional representation we see in New London, right now, we have 15 elected officials, mayor, 7 councilors, 7 Board of Education members, and 14 out of 15 are Democrats.
Yes.
So, and I will add that if Myrna Martinez had not run on both the Green and Republican lines, it would be 15 out of 15.
Yeah, that's fair.
Because, and the reason I say so is that there was actually, had to draw straws. There was a tie for the number 7 spot on Board of Ed between the 2 Democrats, one of whom placed 7 and one placed 8.
Wow.
So, and this is a Democratic town. It's a Democratic majority town, but it's a Democratic monopoly government. So you might have 60% of the people in the city registered, and it isn't that many. It's about 50% registered Democrat, about 40%, 30% Republican. I don't know. It's
certainly not one-sided, though. It's not 100%.
No, it isn't. And if you count the unaffiliated voters, plus the Republicans, plus all the minor parties, the Democrats are a little less than half of the total.
And you actually, interestingly, you have the counterexample over in Norwich, where 100% of the city council was Republican this time around.
Which is very odd. But either way, it's like, it isn't as though you only have one voice, and because of the, and even if within a party you have diversity, freedom of information laws, which consider party caucuses not public, as soon as you have a party monopoly, it's so easy to do too much city business out of the eyes of the public.
Yeah, I think that whereas ranked choice is the ideal system for choosing a single seat or a single candidate, proportional is the best system for choosing a slate of candidates. We have the at-large city council, and that's a great example of an opportunity to use proportional representation, as is the U.S. House. Connecticut sends 5 members to the House as part of their delegation. If they were chosen based on proportional representation,
it might not be 5 Democrats right now.
Yeah, it might not, and 49% of the state that doesn't get represented might not feel so left out. That creates a very negative situation with the opposition that you don't get if those opposition politicians have to work with you next time and next time and next time.
Yeah. Now we have about 1 minute left. So in that minute, let people know if they're interested in getting involved in this initiative, how they can do it.
Well, first and foremost, the easiest way is to reach out to me on Facebook. I am trying to get a little coalition of the willing together to push ranked choice voting, proportional voting, and some of the other reforms we've talked about, common sense reforms. And I want to talk to people from every party, from every political persuasion.
So there's a Facebook page that's called something like Forum to Abolish Two-Party Rule for now. Maybe the name will change.
I believe the group has settled on Count Our Votes. And
Great.
we did register countourvotes.us, although it's not up yet. Right now, it's a closed Facebook group, but if anyone wants to forward emails, either
Right.
to you
And they
or
can
to
always
me.
send to me, rana@nlgreens.org,
Yep.
and I can get the information to the group.
Yeah, and I'm hart.jeffery, that's E-R-E-Y, @gmail.com if you want to get to me directly. That's a great way to do it. So be happy to talk about any of these things.
Because some of this is really, if New London could blaze some trails, who knows?
I wish New London could be a leader. I wish Connecticut could be a leader for other states to follow.
Well, thanks for coming on, Jeff.
Thank you so much for having me, Rana.
And next week, Luther Weeks from Connecticut Voters Count will be on the show, partly analyzing what happened in the presidential and other elections in Connecticut, and also recruiting citizens to observe the mandatory audits that are held after the election that are also, in their own way, very eye-opening ways to see our democracy at work. So we'll see you next week, and thanks again, Jeff.
Thank you.
We're probably clear.
Check one.
Dream